There is a story buried in the Bible that most people read quickly and forget, but if you really stop and listen to it, it feels almost unsettling, because it begins with a fear every human understands, the fear of losing everything. Imagine waking up one morning knowing that by sunset, strangers could walk into your house, take your children, and there would be nothing you could do to stop it. That is exactly where this story begins. In a small town in ancient Israel lived a widow. Her husband had once been a servant of the prophet Elisha, a man who feared God deeply. But when her husband died, he left behind something heavier than grief. He left behind debt. In those days, debt was not just numbers written on paper. Debt was chains. If you could not pay, creditors had the legal right to take your children as servants until the debt was worked off. And that was what was about to happen. One morning, the creditor arrived at her door. You can almost hear the knock. Slow, heavy, final. She knew what it meant. She had nothing left to sell. No savings, no livestock, no land. Only 2 young sons who were about to be taken away. Desperation has a sound. It is the sound of feet running when there is nowhere to run. It is the sound of a voice breaking as it cries for help. And that is how she came to Elisha. She did not come calmly. She did not come with composed words. She cried out to him, telling him everything. Her husband's death, the debt, the creditor, the children who would soon be gone. Elisha listened quietly, and then he asked her a question that must have seemed strange. What do you have in your house? Not what do you need, not how much do you owe, not how can I fix this? He asked, what do you have? The widow hesitated, because the truth felt almost embarrassing. Nothing, she said at first. Then she corrected herself. Nothing, except a small jar of oil, that was all. A small jar, the kind of thing you could hold in one hand. Not enough to sell, not enough to trade, barely enough to cook with for a few days. But Elisha did not dismiss it. Instead, he told her something that must have sounded impossible. He told her to go to her neighbors and borrow empty jars. Not a few, as many as she could find, from everyone, every house, every friend, every stranger willing to lend one. And then he told her to go inside her house, close the door behind her and her sons, and begin to pour oil from her small jar into the empty ones. There was no explanation, no promise of how it would work, just instructions that made no sense, unless you believed that God could do something beyond reason. So she went. Imagine her walking through the village, knocking on doors, asking neighbors for jars. Some probably looked at her with curiosity, some with pity, some perhaps whispered after she left, wondering what she was planning. But she kept going. Jar after jar, clay containers, storage vessels, cracked old pots, anything that could hold oil. By the time she returned home, the room must have looked strange. Empty jars everywhere, lined against walls, sitting on floors. A silent crowd of hollow vessels waiting for something that seemed impossible. Then she closed the door. Inside that small house, there were only 3 people now, the widow and her 2 sons, and 1 small jar of oil. No crowd, no witnesses, no applause, just faith and silence. She picked up the jar. Her hands were probably trembling, not because she expected a miracle, but because she was terrified of disappointment. When you are desperate, hope itself can feel dangerous. She tilted the jar and began to pour. Oil flowed out. At first, nothing unusual, just a thin stream filling the bottom of the first jar. But then something strange happened. The oil kept pouring. The jar in her hand did not empty. Her sons watched as the first container filled to the top. Then another jar was brought, and another, and another. Still, the oil kept flowing. The room began to fill with the scent of olive oil, thick and earthy. The sound of liquid pouring echoed softly against clay walls. Jar after jar filled, each one impossible, each one silent proof that something beyond human power was happening in that small, closed room. You can imagine the expressions on their faces, the disbelief, the growing realization, the quiet, overwhelming understanding that God was providing, not in theory, not in stories, but right there, in their hands. "Bring me another," she said, and her sons kept bringing them. Time seemed to disappear. There was only the pouring, only the steady stream of oil that refused to stop, until finally, one of her sons said words that must have changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "There is not another jar." And in that moment, the oil stopped. Not before, not during, only when there were no more vessels left to receive it. The silence that followed must have felt heavy, almost sacred, the floor covered with full jars, enough oil to pay the debt, enough to live on, enough to save her sons. What began as the worst day of her life had become the day she would never forget for the rest of her life. But the story does not end there, because what this miracle revealed was not only about provision, it was about something deeper, something most people miss when they hear this story. The oil did not stop because God ran out of power. It stopped because there were no more empty jars. And that raises a question that stays with you long after the story ends. How much more could have been given if there had been more empty vessels ready to receive it? That is the part of the story that lingers in the mind, the part that makes you wonder whether sometimes the limits we experience are not limits of heaven, but limits of what we are prepared to hold. And there is one more detail in this story that makes it even more powerful, something about what the widow did after the miracle that most people never think about, because the real transformation in her life was not only the oil, it was who she became after the fear was gone. And that part of the story is where everything changes. The widow sat in that small room surrounded by jars filled to the brim. The same walls that had felt suffocating only hours before now seemed almost unfamiliar, as if the house itself had changed. But the truth was, it wasn't the house that had changed. It was her. A few hours earlier, she had been a woman counting the minutes until her children would be taken away. Now she was surrounded by more provision than she had ever seen in her life. The fear that had pressed on her chest like a weight had lifted, but in its place came something quieter, something deeper. She went back to Elisha and told him everything that had happened. He listened, and then he said something simple. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt. You and your sons can live on what is left." That was it. No dramatic speech, no long explanation, just a quiet confirmation that what had happened was enough, not only to rescue her from disaster, but to give her a future. And that is where most people stop reading the story. But if you pause there and think about it, something extraordinary becomes clear. This miracle was not only about survival, it was about restoration, because debt does more than take money. It takes dignity, it takes peace, it takes sleep. It sits in your mind in the middle of the night and whispers that tomorrow will be worse than today. That widow had been living under that shadow for a long time, long enough that fear had become normal, long enough that hope probably felt like a memory from another life. And yet, in one quiet afternoon, everything changed, not because she suddenly became powerful, not because she suddenly became wealthy, but because she obeyed a small instruction that did not make sense at the time. Borrow jars, pour oil, close the door. Simple actions, quiet actions, but they opened the door to something far greater than she could see. And there is something else in this story that most people miss. The miracle did not happen in public. There was no crowd, no stage, no audience, no applause. The door was closed. Only the widow and her sons saw the oil multiply. That detail matters more than it seems, because it shows that some of the greatest changes in life do not happen in front of people. They happen in the quiet places, in the unseen moments, in decisions no one else even knows you are making. The world often celebrates the visible results, but the real transformation usually happens where no one is watching. And that was true for this widow. When she first picked up that jar, she was a woman defined by fear. But by the time the last jar was filled, she was someone else entirely. She had seen something undeniable, something that changed how she understood her life, her future, and even God himself. And here's the part that stays with you if you think about this story long enough. The oil only stopped when there were no more jars, not when she grew tired, not when the need was met, not when a certain amount had been reached, only when there were no more empty vessels left. That detail feels almost like a whisper hidden inside the story, a quiet truth that echoes far beyond that small house. Sometimes the limit is not the supply. Sometimes the limit is the space we make to receive. Think about it. If she had borrowed only 3 jars, only 3 would have been filled. If she had borrowed 10, 10 would have been filled. The size of the miracle was connected to her willingness to prepare for something she could not yet see. That is a truth that reaches far beyond that moment in history. Because people often pray for change, pray for provision, pray for direction, but at the same time, they prepare for nothing to happen. They keep only 1 jar ready. But this widow did something different. She prepared as if the impossible might actually become possible. And that preparation changed everything. Years later, people in that village may have forgotten the details. They may have forgotten the day the widow went from house to house borrowing jars. They may have forgotten the creditor who never returned. But inside that house, the memory never faded. Her sons would grow up remembering the sound of oil pouring into jar after jar, the moment fear disappeared, the day they realized their lives had been spared, and the widow herself. She would never again look at a small beginning the same way. Because she had learned something that many people never learn. What looks small in your hands can become something immeasurable when placed in the hands of God. A single jar of oil had been enough, not because of what it was, but because of what it became. And that is why this story still lives, still speaks, still lingers in the mind long after it is told. Because at some point, everyone faces a moment when what they have feels too small, too weak, too insignificant to matter. And this story quietly answers that fear. It says that what you have may be small, but small things, placed in the right hands, can change everything. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this. The widow's life did not change when the jars were filled. It changed the moment she decided to trust, pick up the jar, and pour, even when she had no reason to believe anything would happen. That was the real turning point, and it always is.